When Allied pilots first encountered the Mitsubishi A6M Zero in combat, many believed they were facing something that simply should not exist. Reports coming back from the Pacific in late 1941 and early 1942 described an aircraft that seemed to turn inside everything, climb effortlessly, and appear over targets no one thought fighters could reach. To men flying heavier, slower aircraft with limited range, the Zero felt like a technological ambush. It did not just defeat opponents in the air, it shattered assumptions about what carrier-based fighters could do. The Zero did not emerge by accident. It was the product of Japan's strategic reality in the interwar years. Unlike the United States or Britain, Japan knew any major conflict would unfold across vast oceans. Bases would be few, distances immense, and logistics fragile. Aircraft carriers were not a supplement to the fleet. They were the fleet. Fighters that could not escort bombers deep into enemy territory were almost useless. During Japan's war in China in the late 1930s, this limitation became painfully clear. Japanese bombers were often forced to operate without fighter protection, suffering losses that alarmed naval planners. The Imperial Japanese Navy demanded a solution, but what it asked for bordered on impossible. The Navy wanted a carrier fighter that could escort bombers hundreds of miles from base, defeat enemy fighters in close combat, climb quickly, carry heavy armament, and still operate reliably from aircraft carriers. At the time, most engineers believed these requirements contradicted basic physics. Range required fuel. Fuel meant weight. Weight ruined maneuverability and climb. Armor and protection made aircraft heavier still. Several manufacturers refused to bid on the project, judging it unrealistic. Mitsubishi, however, accepted the challenge, assigning the task to an engineer named Jiro Horikoshi. Horikoshi understood that the Navy's demands could not be met by incremental improvements. To build the fighter Japan wanted, something fundamental had to change. Instead of increasing engine power or structural strength, he focused on radical weight reduction and aerodynamic efficiency. Every component was scrutinized. Every unnecessary ounce was eliminated. The aircraft would be built as light as possible, even if that meant sacrificing survivability. There would be no armor protecting the pilot. Fuel tanks would not be self-sealing. Structural margins would be minimal. The aircraft would rely on agility and range, not protection, to survive. This philosophy defined the Zero from the beginning. The airframe was slim and clean, with long wings that provided excellent lift and low wing loading. This allowed the aircraft to turn tightly at low speeds and remain controllable even near the edge of a stall. The engine, though not exceptionally powerful by Western standards, was sufficient when paired with such a lightweight design. The result was an aircraft that seemed to cheat the normal trade-offs of fighter design, at least on the surface. When the prototype flew in 1939, it exceeded expectations. It was faster, more maneuverable, and had a longer range than anything the Japanese Navy had previously operated. By 1940, it entered service as the Type Zero carrier fighter. The name, Zero, came from the Japanese calendar year 2600, but the aircraft would soon earn a far greater reputation. When war broke out in the Pacific, the Zero was already combat-tested and flown by experienced pilots who had honed their skills in China. At Pearl Harbor, Zeros swept aside American opposition with ease. U.S. pilots flying obsolete aircraft were completely outclassed. In the months that followed, the pattern repeated itself across the Pacific. In the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and New Guinea, Allied air forces suffered heavy losses. Pilots accustomed to European-style dogfighting tactics found themselves facing an enemy that refused to fight by familiar rules. The Zero could stay airborne longer, reach further, and maneuver more tightly. Allied fighters that attempted to turn with it were often destroyed within seconds. These early victories created a powerful myth. The Zero was spoken of as invincible. Some pilots believed it was faster than anything in the sky. Others claimed it could not be shot down. Intelligence officers struggled to understand how Japan had leapt so far ahead in fighter design. For a time, the Zero truly did dominate the skies of the Pacific, and that dominance had real consequences. It allowed Japan to expand rapidly, seize territory, and establish defensive perimeters before the Allies could respond effectively. But myths have a dangerous tendency to obscure reality. The Zero's strengths were undeniable, but they were the result of very specific design choices. Those choices also created vulnerabilities that were not immediately apparent to its early opponents. The same features that gave the Zero its legendary agility and range also made it fragile. Without armor or self-sealing fuel tanks, even a few well-placed bullets could be fatal. The aircraft's structure, optimized for lightness, could not absorb much damage. Pilots who survived initial engagements began to notice that when a Zero was hit, it often burned quickly and violently. At first, however, Allied pilots lacked the tactics and technology to exploit these weaknesses. Many flew aircraft designed with very different priorities. The American F-4F Wildcat, for example, was slower and far less maneuverable, but it was rugged and heavily built. Early encounters favored the Zero, not because the Wildcat was poorly designed, but because it was used incorrectly. Pilots were trained to dogfight in turning battles, exactly the kind of fight the Zero was built to win. As the war progressed, experience began to chip away at the Zero's aura. Pilots who survived early encounters started sharing hard-earned lessons. They learned not to turn with the Zero, to use speed and diving attacks instead. They discovered that the Zero struggled at high speeds and lost control in steep dives. They realized that American aircraft could absorb damage that would destroy a Zero outright. Slowly, the narrative began to change. The Zero's early dominance was real, but it was conditional. It thrived in an environment where its strengths were unchallenged and its weaknesses unexplored. As the Allies adapted, introduced new aircraft, and refined their tactics, the balance began to shift. The Zero remained dangerous, but it was no longer untouchable. Its reputation, once built on fear and mystery, would soon be tested against opponents who understood how to fight it. The story of the Zero is not a simple tale of triumph or failure. It is a study in trade-offs, doctrine, and the brutal logic of war. In the beginning, it was exactly what Japan needed: a long-range, highly maneuverable fighter flown by elite pilots. But war does not stand still. Technology evolves. Tactics adapt. An aircraft designed for one phase of a conflict may find themselves outpaced by the next. By the time the Zero's secrets were fully understood, the Pacific War had entered a new phase. The question was no longer whether the Zero was superior, but whether it could survive in a sky filled with faster, tougher, and increasingly numerous Allied fighters. The answer to that question would define the rest of its combat career, and ultimately decide whether the Zero would be remembered as a revolutionary hero or a brilliant weapon overtaken by time. By mid-1942, The myth of the Zero had begun to crack, but the aircraft itself had not changed. What changed was the environment around it. The Pacific War was no longer a series of sudden strikes against unprepared opponents. It was becoming a grinding contest of attrition, production, and adaptation. The Zero, which had been designed for a fast, decisive war fought by elite pilots, now found itself flying day after day against enemies who were learning, surviving, and coming back with better machines and better tactics. One of the first moments that forced Allied planners to truly understand the Zero came not through combat, but through accident. In June 1942, during the Aleutian Islands campaign, a Japanese Zero flown by Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga was damaged by ground fire and forced to make an emergency landing on Akuten Island. The pilot was killed on impact, but the aircraft remained largely intact. For the first time, the United States had a flyable Zero. This was not a wreckage analysis or intelligence guesswork. It was the real thing. When American engineers and test pilots examined the captured aircraft, many of the Zero's mysteries vanished almost immediately. The aircraft's astonishing maneuverability was explained by its extremely low weight and long wings. Its long range came from massive fuel capacity relative to its size. But just as important were the things it lacked. There was no armor plate behind the pilot's seat. The fuel tanks were thin and unprotected. Control cables were exposed and vulnerable. At high speeds, the controls stiffened dramatically, making rapid maneuvers difficult. In dives, the aircraft became unstable and risked structural failure. These findings confirmed what some pilots had already learned the hard way. The Zero was not unbeatable. It was specialized. It excelled in low-speed turning fights and long-range escort missions, but it paid for those abilities with fragility and limitations at high speed. The problem for Japan was that its entire naval air doctrine had been built around this aircraft. Rather than evolving rapidly, Japanese fighter development stagnated. New designs were slow to appear, and improvements to the Zero itself were incremental and often constrained by the same philosophy that had created it. Meanwhile, the Allies were changing fast. American aircraft designers had taken a very different approach to fighter design. They accepted heavier weight in exchange for survivability, firepower, and speed. As new fighters entered service, the Zero's advantages began to erode. The F-6F Hellcat and the F-4U Corsair were not designed to outturn the Zero. They were designed to kill it. With more powerful engines, better armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and heavy machine gun armament, these aircraft allowed pilots to fight on their own terms. The shift in tactics was just as important as the shift in technology. American pilots were trained to use energy fighting, diving attacks, and teamwork. They avoided prolonged turning battles and relied on altitude and speed to dictate engagements. The thatch weave, developed earlier in the war, became a standard tactic, allowing pairs of aircraft to cover each other's tails and neutralize the Zero's maneuverability. Against these methods, the Zero struggled. Still, it would be a mistake to portray the Zero's decline as sudden or inevitable. In the hands of experienced pilots, it remained deadly. Japanese naval aviators were among the most skilled in the world at the start of the war. Their training emphasized gunnery, formation flying, and combat realism. Early in the conflict, many Zero pilots had hundreds of flight hours and combat experience from China. These men extracted every ounce of performance from their aircraft, often compensating for its weaknesses with skill and aggression. But this advantage could not be replaced. As the war intensified, Japan's pilot losses mounted. Training programs were shortened. Fuel shortages limited flight hours. New pilots entered combat with only a fraction of the experience their predecessors had enjoyed. The Zero, unforgiving of mistakes and lacking protection, became a dangerous aircraft for inexperienced pilots to fly in combat. What had once been a precision instrument wielded by experts now exposed its flaws when flown by novices. At the same time, Allied production overwhelmed Japanese industry. While Japan struggled to replace losses, the United States produced aircraft in staggering numbers. New pilots arrived with standardized training and increasingly effective aircraft. Battles that once favored Japan now ended with lopsided losses for Japanese air units. The Zero's light construction, once its greatest strength, became a liability in a war defined by firepower and durability. The Zero also faced a strategic problem that no modification could solve. It had been designed for offense, not defense. Its long range allowed it to escort bombers deep into enemy territory, but as Japan shifted to a defensive posture, that advantage mattered less. Instead, fighters were needed to intercept high-altitude bombers, defend bases, and survive repeated engagements. The Zero struggled in these roles. Its climb rate and speed were insufficient against newer Allied aircraft, and its armament was increasingly outdated. Japanese engineers attempted to address these issues through upgrades. Later variants added more powerful engines, reinforced wings, and heavier armament. Some versions improved survivability slightly, but every improvement added weight, eroding the very qualities that had made the Zero exceptional. The aircraft was caught in a design trap. To survive, it needed to change, but changing it undermined its core identity. By 1944, the Zero was no longer the terror of the Pacific skies. It was outclassed in speed, firepower, and survivability. Allied pilots now sought out engagements that earlier they would have avoided. The psychological balance had reversed. Where once Allied pilots feared the Zero, Japanese pilots now faced overwhelming odds against faster, tougher opponents who controlled altitude and initiative. Yet even in decline, the Zero continued to fight. It was present in nearly every major Pacific battle, from Guadalcanal to the Philippines. It defended carrier task forces, escorted bombers, and intercepted Allied strikes long after its technological edge had vanished. In the desperate final stages of the war, it was even used in roles never envisioned by its designers, including kamikaze attacks, where its long range and payload capacity were repurposed for suicide missions. This grim transformation underscored the aircraft's legacy. The Zero was never meant to be expendable. It was built to be flown by highly trained pilots, who would return from missions again and again. Its use as a disposable weapon reflected not its design philosophy, but the desperation of a nation running out of options. The question of whether the Zero was a hero or a failure depends entirely on perspective. In its early years, it reshaped aerial warfare in the Pacific and enabled Japan's rapid expansion. It forced the Allies to rethink tactics, training, and aircraft design. Few fighters can claim such an impact. But its inability to evolve quickly enough in a prolonged industrial war ultimately sealed its fate. The Zero's story is not one of incompetence or flawed thinking. It is a story of optimization taken to its extreme. The aircraft was perfectly suited for the war Japan expected to fight, but disastrously ill-suited for the war that actually unfolded. As the skies over the Pacific filled with newer machines and better trained opponents, the Zero's legend faded, leaving behind a complex legacy of brilliance, vulnerability, and tragic persistence. And yet, even as the Zero's dominance waned, its influence endured. Every Allied pilot who fought in the Pacific learned to respect it, study it, and adapt to it. In doing so, they ensured that the Zero would never again rule the skies, but also that it would never be forgotten. As the war moved into its later phases, the Zero's struggle became inseparable from the broader collapse of Japan's air power. By 1943, the Pacific was no longer defined by surprise attacks and swift victories, but by sustained campaigns where industrial output and logistics mattered more than individual brilliance. The Zero, once the embodiment of Japanese naval aviation, now carried the weight of expectations it could no longer fulfill. The changing nature of air combat exposed weaknesses that could not be corrected through pilot skill alone. Allied fighters increasingly operated at higher altitudes, where the Zero's performance dropped sharply. American aircraft, powered by supercharged engines, could climb higher, dive faster, and recover more safely. In engagements that began above 20,000 feet, the Zero often found itself at a disadvantage before the first shot was fired. Japanese pilots knew this, and many avoided combat at such altitudes whenever possible, but strategic realities made avoidance impossible. The introduction of radar-directed interceptions further complicated matters. Allied fleets and bases could now detect incoming Japanese aircraft long before visual contact. This allowed American fighters to position themselves with altitude and numerical advantage. The Zero had been designed for surprise and initiative, not for fighting uphill battles against prepared defenders. Each encounter drained Japan's dwindling pool of experienced aviators. The attrition was brutal. Veteran pilots, who had survived the early years of the war, were increasingly rare. Many of those who remained were physically exhausted and mentally worn down by constant combat. The Zero, which demanded finesse and anticipation, became harder to fly effectively under such conditions. Even minor mistakes could prove fatal. A single burst from an American fighter could ignite an unprotected fuel tank or sever a control cable. Training programs attempted to compensate by pushing new pilots through accelerated courses, but the results were uneven. Young aviators often lacked the instinctive understanding of energy management and situational awareness that earlier generations had developed through extensive flight hours. The Zero offered no forgiveness for hesitation or error. As a result, casualty rates among inexperienced pilots soared, further weakening Japan's air arm. At the same time, the Allies were refining their methods with ruthless efficiency. American pilots no longer viewed the Zero as a mystical opponent. It was now a known quantity, cataloged and studied in training manuals. Pilots were taught exactly how to exploit its weaknesses, avoid turning fights, use vertical maneuvers, attack from above, and disengage at will. This institutional knowledge spread rapidly across squadrons, reducing the Zero's psychological impact. The aircraft's armament also became increasingly inadequate. While its cannons remained deadly at close range, their limited ammunition and slower rate of fire made them less effective in high-speed passes. American fighters, armed with multiple .50 caliber machine guns, could unleash dense streams of fire during brief firing windows. Even glancing hits could cripple a Zero. The disparity in firepower became a defining feature of late-war air combat. Japanese engineers continued to search for solutions, but they were constrained by material shortages and industrial limitations. New fighter designs such as the J-2M Raiden and N-1K Shuriken showed promise, but they arrived too late and in insufficient numbers. Production bottlenecks, fuel scarcity, and Allied bombing campaigns hampered manufacturing efforts. The Zero, already in mass production, remained the backbone of Japanese fighter forces by default. This reliance created a vicious cycle. As newer aircraft struggled to reach frontline units, the Zero remained in service longer than intended. Each loss further depleted experienced pilots, making it harder to employ the aircraft effectively. The gap between Allied and Japanese air capabilities widened with each passing month. Despite these challenges, the Zero continued to score victories. Isolated engagements, particularly in the hands of skilled pilots, still demonstrated its lethal potential. Allied pilots who underestimated it paid the price. The aircraft's ability to turn tightly at low speeds remained unmatched, and in chaotic dogfights, it could still reverse the roles of hunter and prey. But these moments became increasingly rare, overshadowed by the broader trend of Allied dominance. By late 1944, the strategic situation had deteriorated dramatically for Japan. Carrier losses, fuel shortages, and pilot attrition crippled naval aviation. The Zero, once a symbol of offensive power, was now tasked with defending shrinking territories against overwhelming force. Airfields were bombed relentlessly, aircraft destroyed on the ground before they could take off. The skies over the Philippines and later over Japan itself became killing fields. It was during this period that the Zero's role shifted most dramatically. Faced with the impossibility of achieving air superiority, Japanese leadership turned to extreme measures. The kamikaze campaign emerged not from the Zero's design, but from desperation. The aircraft's long range and ability to carry explosives made it suitable for suicide attacks, even as its combat effectiveness declined. Many Zeros were stripped of unnecessary equipment to increase range, reinforcing their original design philosophy in the service of a grim new purpose. For the pilots assigned to these missions, the Zero became both weapon and coffin. Its lack of armor and self-sealing tanks, once accepted as necessary trade-offs, now ensured that few would survive their final flights. The aircraft's light construction allowed it to carry large explosive charges, but offered no protection against defensive fire. These missions achieved tactical successes, damaging Allied ships and causing casualties, but they could not alter the outcome of the war. In the final months of the conflict, the Zero's presence in the skies became increasingly symbolic. It represented a bygone era of Japanese air power, a time when skill and surprise had allowed a smaller force to dominate. Now, it flew against insurmountable odds, often piloted by young men with minimal training and no expectation of return. The contrast between the aircraft's early triumphs and its final use could not have been more stark. Allied pilots who encountered Zeros during this period often described mixed emotions. There was respect for the aircraft's history and the bravery of its pilots, but also an awareness that the outcome was inevitable. The Zero was no longer a rival in technological terms. It was a reminder of how quickly the balance of power could shift in modern warfare. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, thousands of Zeros remained scattered across airfields, jungles, and islands throughout the Pacific. Many were destroyed, abandoned, or captured. The aircraft that had once symbolized Japan's aerial dominance now stood, as relics of a strategy that could not adapt fast enough to survive a prolonged war. The legacy of the Zero is therefore deeply complicated. It was neither a simple failure nor an unqualified success. It was a masterpiece of engineering for a specific moment in time, pushed beyond its intended limits by circumstances it was never designed to endure. Its early victories reshaped the Pacific War, forcing the Allies to learn, adapt, and innovate. Its later struggles highlighted the dangers of over-specialization in an era defined by rapid technological change. By the time the war ended, the Zero had become a legend not because it remained dominant, but because it had revealed so much about the nature of aerial combat. It showed how design philosophy, pilot training, industrial capacity, and strategy are inseparable. It demonstrated that even the most brilliant weapon can become obsolete if it cannot evolve alongside the war it fights. And yet, for all its flaws and failures, the Zero's story continues to captivate. It remains one of the most recognizable aircraft in history, a symbol of both ingenuity and tragedy. Its rise and fall mirror the arc of Japan's war itself, swift, stunning, and ultimately unsustainable. As the Zero entered the final year of the war, it was no longer fighting on equal terms, but it was still very much present. Across the Pacific, from the Philippines to Okinawa, and finally over the Japanese home islands, the aircraft continued to rise into skies dominated by Allied air power. Its presence was less about achieving victory and more about delaying defeat, buying time in a conflict that Japan was rapidly losing control of. By 1944, the Allied air strategy had shifted decisively toward overwhelming force. Long-range escort fighters accompanied bombers deep into Japanese-held territory, neutralizing any chance of surprise. The Zero, designed for fluid dogfights and offensive sweeps, now found itself scrambling defensively against formations that dwarfed anything seen earlier in the war. Even when Japanese pilots managed to intercept, they were often outnumbered several times over. The introduction of newer American fighters sealed the Zero's fate. Aircraft like the P-51 Mustang and F-4U Corsair combined speed, altitude performance, durability, and heavy armament in ways the Zero simply could not match. These fighters could dictate the terms of engagement at will. They climbed faster, dove harder, and absorbed punishment that would have torn a Zero apart. Japanese pilots quickly learned that once an American fighter disengaged, pursuit was futile. Yet the Zero's persistence was not merely a matter of necessity. It was also cultural. The aircraft had become deeply intertwined with Japanese naval aviation identity. Many senior officers had flown it themselves or built their careers during its early successes. Replacing it was not just a logistical challenge, but an emotional one. The Zero symbolized a belief system rooted in pilot superiority and offensive spirit, even as the realities of modern war rendered that belief increasingly obsolete. This attachment influenced decision-making at the highest levels. Resources that might have accelerated newer designs were instead poured into incremental Zero upgrades that could never fully close the gap. Improved engines, clipped wings, and reinforced structures helped marginally, but each modification chipped away at the very qualities that had made the aircraft exceptional. The Zero became heavier, less agile, and still lacked adequate protection. It was caught between eras, no longer dominant, not yet replaced. The battle for the Philippines illustrated this decline vividly. As American forces returned in force, Japanese air units attempted to contest the skies with a mixture of outdated aircraft and exhausted crews. Zeros rose from airstrips under constant bombardment, often taking off under fire, only to be intercepted minutes later. Losses mounted rapidly. The air battles were no longer contests of maneuver, but brutal slaughters dictated by radar, coordination, and numerical superiority. Over Leyte Gulf, the Zero's role shifted almost entirely to desperation tactics. With fuel scarce and replacement aircraft nearly non-existent, pilots were ordered to make every sortie count, regardless of survival. The aircraft's long range allowed it to reach American fleets, but its vulnerability ensured that many never returned. Each mission became a one-way gamble against overwhelming defenses. The increasing reliance on kamikaze operations was both a tactical decision and a psychological acknowledgement of defeat. The Zero, stripped of radios and guns in some cases, was reduced to a delivery system for explosives. Its legendary maneuverability, once used to outfly opponents, was now irrelevant. What mattered was range and reliability, qualities the Zero still possessed in abundance. These attacks shocked Allied sailors and inflicted real damage, but they did not restore Japan's air power. Instead, they underscored the aircraft's tragic transformation. The Zero, conceived as a weapon of finesse and skill, had become a blunt instrument born of desperation. For the pilots involved, there was no illusion of glory, only duty and resignation. As the Allies pushed closer to Japan, the air war intensified. B-29 superfortresses began systematic bombing campaigns against Japanese cities, flying higher and faster than most interceptors could reach effectively. Zeros were launched to intercept these bombers, but their limited altitude performance and light armament made success rare. Even when they managed to close the distance, defensive fire from bomber formations exacted a heavy toll. Attempts were made to modify the Zero specifically for bomber interception. Heavier cannons, reinforced wings, and even ramming tactics were introduced. These measures further degraded the aircraft's flight characteristics, while offering only marginal improvements in effectiveness. Each sortie became a near-suicidal effort against an enemy that seemed untouchable. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was devastating. They were no longer fighting for air superiority, or even local control. They were fighting to slow the inevitable, often without hope of survival. Many understood that the Zero they flew was a relic of a different phase of the war, unsuited to the battles they were being asked to fight. Meanwhile, Allied pilots viewed the Zero with a mix of historical respect and tactical confidence. Training films and combat reports emphasized its weaknesses repeatedly. Pilots were reminded never to underestimate it, but also reassured that discipline and teamwork would prevail. The fear that had once surrounded the aircraft was gone, replaced by routine procedures and drilled responses. By mid-1945, Japan's air defenses were a shadow of their former selves. Fuel shortages grounded many aircraft. Airfields were cratered and unusable. Maintenance crews lacked spare parts and tools. Zeros sat idle, cannibalized to keep a few airworthy. The aircraft that had once been produced in massive numbers now existed as scattered remnants of a collapsing war effort. When Allied aircraft roamed Japanese skies virtually unchallenged, the Zero's symbolic role became painfully clear. It stood as a reminder of how quickly technological advantage can evaporate when innovation stalls. The aircraft's initial brilliance had delayed Japan's recognition of the need for change, and by the time that realization came, it was too late. The surrender of Japan marked the end of the Zero's combat career, but not the end of its story. captured aircraft were shipped to Allied countries for evaluation, display, and study. Engineers marveled at its construction, its simplicity, and its aerodynamic efficiency. Test pilots flew restored examples, confirming both its strengths and its fatal vulnerabilities. In museums and air shows, the Zero would later be remembered primarily for its early war dominance. Yet those who studied its full operational history understood a deeper truth. The aircraft's downfall was not the result of incompetence, but of a design philosophy locked to a specific moment in time. It had been optimized brilliantly for one kind of war and forced to fight another. The Zero's final flights were not victories, but they were not meaningless. They forced the Allies to remain vigilant, to respect their enemy, and to acknowledge the human cost on both sides. The aircraft's legacy became inseparable from the pilots who flew it, men who fought with courage even as the odds turned decisively against them. As the Pacific War drew to a close, the Zero faded from the skies, but its imprint on aviation history remained indelible. It had reshaped early combat, influenced Allied design, and demonstrated the power and peril of specialization. Its story was no longer about dominance, but about endurance, adaptation, and the unforgiving pace of technological warfare. By the time the war ended, the Zero was no longer a weapon shaping events, but a symbol burdened with contradiction. It had begun as one of the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world, feared and admired in equal measure. It ended its service flying missions of near certain death, unable to protect the very nation it had once defended so effectively. This arc, from dominance to desperation, encapsulated the larger trajectory of Japan's air war in the Pacific. In the immediate aftermath of surrender, Allied forces encountered hundreds of abandoned Zeros across Japan and former, occupied territories. Some were intact, others stripped for parts, many left to rust on airfields that would never again see combat operations. For Allied pilots walking among the wreckage, the sight was sobering. This was the aircraft that had once ruled the skies over Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. Now it was silent, grounded, and obsolete. Technical evaluations conducted by Allied engineers painted a clear picture. The Zero was exceptionally light, aerodynamically clean, and remarkably easy to fly. Its controls were harmonized, its turning ability unmatched by most contemporaries. But these same traits came at the expense of survivability. The absence of armor, self-sealing tanks, and structural redundancy meant that damage, which could be shrugged off by American or British fighters, was often fatal to a Zero. These findings reinforced lessons already learned in combat. The Zero was not inherently inferior. It was simply designed around assumptions that no longer held true. It reflected a belief that skill and maneuverability could compensate for firepower and protection, a belief that worked only while opponents were unprepared or technologically behind. Once the Allies adapted, the Zero's advantages became liabilities. The pilots who flew it carried these contradictions with them into the post-war years. Many survived the conflict with a deep sense of loss, not only for fallen comrades, but for the ideals they had believed in. For them, the Zero was more than a machine. It was a symbol of youth, confidence, and a moment when victory seemed possible. Its decline mirrored their own disillusionment as the war dragged on. Some former pilots spoke openly about their experiences in later decades. They described the early thrill of flying an aircraft that felt alive in their hands, responsive and graceful. They also spoke of fear that grew as Allied fighters became faster, tougher, and deadlier. They recalled missions where escape was no longer an option, where survival depended on luck as much as skill. In contrast, Allied veterans often reflected on the Zero with a mixture of respect and relief. Early encounters had been terrifying, especially before its weaknesses were understood. Pilots who faced it in 1942 often admitted they underestimated it, paying for that mistake with lives and aircraft. By 1944, however, encounters with Zeros were approached methodically, with discipline and confidence. The Zero also left a lasting mark on aircraft design worldwide. Its emphasis on range and maneuverability influenced post-war thinking about lightweight fighters, particularly in nations rebuilding their air forces from limited resources. At the same time, its vulnerabilities became cautionary lessons about the dangers of sacrificing protection and adaptability for short-term advantages. In museums today, restored Zeros sit beneath bright lights, often presented as icons of early Pacific War aviation. Visitors admire their elegant lines and compact form, rarely aware of the full story behind the metal and rivets. The aircraft's reputation as either a superweapon or a death trap oversimplifies a far more complex reality. The truth is that the Zero was neither purely hero nor villain. It was a product of its time, shaped by strategic priorities, industrial limitations, and cultural beliefs. It succeeded brilliantly when those factors aligned with the realities of war. It failed tragically when they did not. The phrase, "Zero or hero," captures this duality perfectly. In its early months, the aircraft was a hero of Japanese expansion, enabling victories that reshaped the Pacific. Later, it became a symbol of stubborn persistence, flying long after its relevance had faded. Its pilots displayed courage throughout, regardless of whether the aircraft they flew could still compete. The Zero story also underscores a broader lesson about warfare and technology. No weapon remains dominant forever. Success breeds complacency, and complacency invites defeat. The Allies' ability to analyze, adapt, and innovate ultimately neutralized the Zero's early advantages. Japan's inability to pivot quickly enough sealed its fate. Even so, dismissing the Zero as outdated or overrated misses its true significance. For a brief but crucial period, it forced the world to rethink aerial combat. It exposed weaknesses in Allied doctrine and accelerated advancements that shaped the rest of the war. Its influence extended far beyond the number of victories it achieved. Today, historians continue to debate the Zero's place among the great fighters of World War II. Some emphasize its kill ratios and early dominance. Others focus on its fragility and decline. Both views are correct, and neither tells the full story alone. The Zero cannot be understood in isolation from the war it fought and the people who flew it. As aviation technology advanced into the jet age, the Zero became an artifact of a bygone era. Its fabric-covered control surfaces, exposed engines, and mechanical simplicity stood in stark contrast to the pressurized cockpits and radar-guided missiles that followed. Yet its legacy endured, reminding future designers of the delicate balance between performance, protection, and adaptability. The Zero's final contribution to history may lie in its ability to provoke reflection. It challenges easy narratives about superiority and weakness. It reminds us that innovation without sustainability is fleeting, and that bravery cannot overcome systemic shortcomings forever. In the end, the Zero was both zero and hero. It was a masterpiece constrained by philosophy. It was a weapon that reshaped a war, then was reshaped by it. And above all, It was flown by men who faced overwhelming odds with skill, determination, and, often, heartbreaking sacrifice. That is why the A6M Zero remains one of the most studied and debated aircraft of World War II. Not because it was perfect, but because its story reflects the brutal reality of modern war, where brilliance burns bright, fades quickly, and leaves behind lessons written in metal, fuel, and blood.